We're in play.
Beautiful.
So, Karlos, we're going to play a game called Sevens.
Mm-hmm.
This gets a little bit of an imprint into your life and how it's gone over the years in 7-year increments.
Mm-hmm.
And how this game goes is that you start when you're born, a little bit of an interlude into your parents as well. Mm-hmm. You don't have to say their names, but just introduce them and their cultural context. Mm-hmm. So where they are born, their lineage or whatnot. So where your sort of family line runs. Mm-hmm. And then we'll go from 7 to 14 to 21. So where were you born?
I was born in a town called Gunnedah in country New South Wales, northwest New South Wales, out near Tamworth.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And what was that? What was your environment like, and who were your parents?
Yeah, so my parents are Di and Owen. The environment that I grew up in from age 0 to 7 was on a family farm, a small hobby farm, about 20 kilometres out of town. It was right on a river. It was. My parents were school teachers, and so there was lots of farming land around, but ours was more like a hobby farm. It was 50 acres, but we had some cattle and some fruit trees and chickens and the river down the back. So, yeah.
And as school teachers, they're very connected to the community.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah. Interfacing with lots of students and parents, obviously, and my dad was very prominent within local council and ALP party and president of every committee on town at some stage through his life. So yeah, he was quite active.
Yeah. And what was where do you come from? What's your cultural heritage?
My cultural heritage.
Do you know? Like, I personally don't really know.
Yeah, know yours? Or,
yeah, it's quite complex, and I haven't gone fully deep into family trees or anything. All my family lines are quite broken.
Mm-mm. Yeah, I mean, I jokingly say that I was born into the cult of the New South Wales Teachers Federation. We're all born into a cult. That's our culture, so that was...
culture.
Yeah, exactly. That was part of mine. My lineage, my grandparents on my mother's side were Scottish, so my grandfather was directly from Scotland, and my grandmother, her parents had come out from Scotland. And on my father's side, I know somebody, extended family member, got in touch at some stage, and there was like Irish stuff back there. There's some speculation, probably mainly from my mother, that there could have been some Indigenous Australian, not that you would see it in my skin tone, but my uncle, they used to call him Blackie, and my grandmother occasionally looked like she just walked out of the bush. So there could have been that inbreeding, or not inbreeding, but breeding with Indigenous. That's speculation. Mm-hmm. But that's the genetic lines.
Of course, in that culture at that time, like, that was a very taboo thing, but it happened
totally
a lot.
Totally.
Yeah. Hence, part of our confusion as a society and a culture.
Definitely.
What about at 7? Where were you?
So at 7, I lived on this family property. I was going to primary school, Gunnedah Primary School. That was, I guess, what comes to mind. There's many things, but at 5, I had a significant operation on my leg, removing bone spurs. That was quite a traumatic experience for me. But yeah,
how do bone spurs form? Like, what? I actually haven't heard of that before.
Yeah, they're like there's platelets on the bone, as far as I understand, and they grow. Mine actually grow like hooks. They have reformed since I had them removed. But on an X-ray, one hooks is below the knee and hooks down, and the other one hooks up. At that time, it was elective surgery, but when they opened me up, they found that the nerves were wrapping around the bone spurs, and if they had continued to grow, they would have severed the nerves and I wouldn't be able to walk. So it was much longer surgery than initially anticipated. But yeah, I definitely experienced some anesthetic trauma from that experience, you know. And 7, you know, is just going to school, living on this family farm, doing lots of sporting activities as a kid after school and weekends, and that gig.
We're at 14.
14, high school, Gunnedah High School. 14 probably would have been the age that I first started smoking weed and drinking booze. So entry into those teenage years, and the peer connections that you have sort of becoming more important to you, getting into music. Probably about that time I started taking up the drums, which I then pursued throughout my school years, and eventually ended up at university studying music. Yeah.
And that would be probably more like when 21?
Yeah, 21 I was at uni. Yep, Southern Cross University in Lismore, doing a Bachelor of Arts, majoring in contemporary music on drums. Yeah.
Yeah, and introduced to this part of the country, this part of the world.
Well, I got introduced to this part of the world around the Byron Shire when I was about 10, because my parents bought a investment property in Byron. There had been some family friends. My mother had interestingly met a woman named Jenny who, when they were at university, and they discovered they were born on the same day in the same hospital, and so they became best of friends, and she had a daughter about the same year as me, and so we used to go on family holidays quite regularly together, and they originally lived in Coffs Harbour, and then Jenny got a teaching position in Byron Bay, so we came to visit them here, and it was not long after that my parents bought an investment property, so we used to come up, you know, once or twice a year for school holidays to the coast, and so Byron had already sort of become a bit of a second home to me before I moved to Lismore to university in Northern Rivers. Yeah, so I think it was part of my destiny to be in the Shire through that connection. And interestingly, you know, I lived with that girl, the daughter of my mother's friend, my first year of university, and we lived with another girl whose mother was also born on the same day as our mothers as well. And my friend Peter, her mother passed a couple of years ago, and I now live in her residence in Ocean Shores.
Ah, that's the
connection.
That's the connection.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the beautiful thing about those long-standing connections, and the depth of those. You know, it's hard. It's what they say, like blood's thicker than water, or like they give you a sense of connection and community, part of community. Yes, and you know that. As well as the blood connections and whatnot, you know, those soul connections, you know, I don't think it was any accident that my mother and her mother were born on the same day in the same hospital, and their lives weaved together at university, and then all of the miraculous interconnections that have taken place since that time, you know. Giving you an understanding of synchronicities and that kind of thing, which will later connect you or allow you to sort of kind of, I suppose, open your soul or your mind to the world and the possibilities of phenomena. Definitely. Okay, what about 28? 28, I was still hanging around the Northern Rivers Shire in Lismore. I had met a man at university. I was doing a course called Spiritual Wellbeing, and I was introduced into the Indigenous through the Indigenous department at SCU. It was all based on Stanislav Grof's work around spiritual emergence and spiritual emergency, and I met a man who came in to do a men's workshop, and he later became a friend, a healer, a work colleague, a flatmate at various times, but he was managing a residential care youth service, and I came in sort of under him I thought I was just going to get some work experience, but I was thrown in the deep end, and I worked 5 years through my mid-20s
doing residential care, youth work, trauma-informed care. And that was, at that time, I was sort of at 28, letting go of the music side of my life and transitioning more into things of an esoteric, personal development nature. That job, provided me finances to be able to travel the world and pursue some of these courses and things that I was interested in. At 28, I also entered into a very deep love relationship with a woman for 2 years who was really the only partner that I've ever lived with. So that lasted until I was 30 and ended in quite a heartbreaking way, and unpacked that for a few years afterwards.
Which is up to 35.
Yeah, so 35, I guess after that relationship, I was trying to expand my worldview and career horizons and things. I went up to the Gold Coast and lived there for a year, was working in a casino in my own personal created nightmare for 6 months or so, but I was also using that time to do a lot of study in neuro-linguistic programming and hypnotherapy, and that doing those courses led to lots of connections with people who were in various industries and fields all over the country, and so that broadened my horizons. I liked the psychology associated not only with therapy but also with sales, and so I moved to Melbourne and got into some sales jobs down there, working for travel agents and telcos and cinemas.
NLP would come in handy for that.
Definitely does, yeah, definitely. And so by the time I was 35, I'd gone through a number of ego deaths and initiations and things that had led me to a body of work called the Template. So I was previously facilitating a body of work called The Ancient Secret of the Flower of Life, based on an ancient Egyptian mystery school and knowledge and application of sacred geometry and activating the light body or the Merkaba. And as I had been studying that over in the States, in Mexico and Egypt, I had also come into contact with this body of work called the Template. And so again, through a number of synchronicities and initiations, that kind of led me into facilitating that work all over the planet for 7 years. So when I was 35, that's what I was doing. I was traveling a lot around Australia and New Zealand and the States, facilitating workshops.
That's about when I met you.
Yeah, and that course, because geometry is ultimately the great connector, and it did connect me with lots of amazing people all over the planet, yourself included, so that made amazing connections doing that work for a number of years.
Which probably leads you to about now, 42?
I'm 44, I'll be 45 this year.
Okay.
So where were we, 35 to 42? 42, yeah. That journey with the Template ended pretty much on my 40th birthday, and I again reassessed my life at that point, decided I wanted to go back to university and pursue a counselling degree. So I began study at the Australian College of Applied Psychology, doing a postgrad diploma in counselling. During that time decided to get some part-time work, went back into doing youth work and the trauma-informed care there, and both of those things, the counselling and the training that I get with the agency that I work for, have been fantastic, and I suppose that's taken me to where I'm at now. Yeah.
And how does that feel where you're at now?
Good. Yeah, I feel in a good place. Like I've always pursued, I guess, personal development, therapeutic modalities and things. And the counselling degree, I kind of tricked myself into thinking that I was going to be studying an academic course, and found myself in a parallel process, undergoing a shamanic initiation at the same time, and doing a deep dive into the codependent, narcissistic spectrum and interplay in relating. Did a lot of therapy myself during that time, unpacking, particular codependent tendencies and where they've stemmed from within the family and ancestry lineage, and how they've played themselves out within, intersexual relating. And I as much as I love exploring my own inner world, I also like being on a journey with people, with clients, doing that work and, going into their shadow and some dark places with them and navigating through that, and ultimately attempting to, help somebody align with what I would call their higher self. So I'm quite passionate about doing that with men and women. I've also found a deep passion for doing men's work. And I guess, where I came to see you this morning just to have a catch up as we do. And I told you, I'd sat down in front of the video camera this morning attempting to elaborate on, I guess, a theme of wanting to explore a process that I have found myself in at the moment, that I thought was a good topic, to share with others, via the internet and social media, because tracking and stalking our own inner process, again, is something that I'm quite passionate about, and I find that when I share something of my own experience with other people, it's quite relatable,
100%.
Yeah. There's always things, when you're playing the role of therapist or counselor, with somebody, that it's not about you, and you're not trying to hijack that experience, that your focus is them, supporting them on their journey. But I have found that, when appropriate, to share my own inner experience really helps people to understand their process. It's relatable, and can be inspiring for them, and it's helpful. So I guess I came thinking, okay, well, we'll share something of my own vulnerability and authenticity today with that process, and here you are, I guess exploring a deeper process of these 7-year phases of life, which is all part of, whatever process we find ourselves in,
Yeah, well, I did this process with Dane Thomas the other day, and straight away he's like, oh, free therapy. Yeah. Fantastic.
Cool.
So he could see, what, when you, like you said, tracking, when you go back and you track, certain points in time and certain parts of your life, sometimes you're not, thinking about them on your daily, but you go back in and, for example, an interesting process that I did in a workshop one time was write my whole sexual history down. And that's really a very interesting sort of process to do. You can actually start uncovering where little triggers or traumas may have come from, or stigmas or hang-ups or whatnot. But like you're saying, like a psychologist, a podcast is very similar. You've got to watch yourself. You've got to keep your deep listening and before you take over. It's not about you.
Well, we're having a sharing too.
We're having a sharing.
And that's why I came to you this morning, because it was like, as I said to you, I oftentimes when I'm doing a sharing on YouTube or whatever format it is, I'll write out the entire presentation, and that takes me quite a lot of time and energy, and then I'll read that to the camera, and I do that so I don't have to look at myself, and that throws me off, and I in many ways prefer just doing a transmission, that is in the podcast format, where it's a two-way dialogue, and it's a sharing, it's not just about me, but it's a unpacking together, and inspiring together.
Well, what do you want to unpack here and now?
Well, I guess, exploring the process that I have been in the last few weeks, like you said, writing things down, like that I was thinking about, well, I'll share some of my own process, but also the tools that I use to regulate my emotional state, to get back into a healthy state. And one of those is journaling. Find it very helpful to write thoughts and feelings out, externalize them, and then be able to rearrange them, and I advise clients to do the same. Of course, all of these techniques that may be helpful for me, they'll be helpful for many people, but everybody's got to use what is appropriate for them. But certainly journaling, I have.
And do you have like a pen and paper next to your bed or something like that? Is it something that just happened in the middle of the night, or do you sit down with a cup of tea and...
Both, both of those things. And if I don't have a pen and paper near me, I'll use the mobile phone and notepad in that to get out things that I think are pertinent. But yeah, definitely, I find that in the middle of the night, like I might wake from a dream and have a particular emotional state running that's more acute, in those early morning stages. So writing at that time is helpful for me, or when I get up and I drink tea first thing in the morning, and I'm more perhaps associated to whatever emotional content is present at the time. I find that journaling at that stage is helpful. I've talked in some of the other presentations I've given on my channel, Future Self Dreaming, a lot about my respect for the grief process. That really, when I did that spiritual emergence course at university, that Stanislav Grof's work around spiritual awakening, that it's very much associated to the process of grief, those stages of grief that we go through when we let go of a previous identity we experience, a loss of some form, and we have to reorientate our sense of self moving forward in life in light of that loss. And it makes us question who we are, our identity, our narratives. And so, I've been mindful of perhaps one of the significant events for me over the last couple of months was the loss of a girlfriend who had taken her own life, and reflecting on the experiences that I had with her, and how those experiences have changed the trajectory of my life. As I mentioned to you, I had cut her out of my life about 4 years ago because of the level of toxicity of interacting with her. She had been diagnosed with borderline personality several years ago, and at that stage it was when I was doing my counselling degree and doing a lot of therapy myself, and realising my tendencies to codependent tendencies to people please and not have very healthy boundaries, and savior rescuer type programs and things, and found myself in a situation with a partner where I was physically abused, allowed myself to be physically abused, and that helped. It was a catalyst for really, I tried to perhaps get to the depths of these themes with therapists in the past, and that catalyst helped me to really go to places that were dissociated and split off and denied and abandoned, and to really help heal that part of me. And at that time I had to put in place some healthy boundaries, and that was people that I felt were toxic and not healthy for my inner world. I needed to be at a distance. And so that girlfriend was, cut off at that time. And regardless of that, you know, I'd shared a lot of journey with her. And so attending her funeral opened a lot of the feeling world again, you know, and thankfully was able to help me reflect on the positive qualities that she brought and all of the connections with people and compassion for her suffering and torment, and also the deep dive experientially into what it's like to be around somebody that has that level of trauma. You know, you can pathologize it into borderline personality disorder, and there's various characteristics and markers that they have for that, diagnosing with the Diagnostic Statistic Manual in that cluster B personality narcissistic spectrum. But yeah, it taught me a lot, that relationship, you know. So I think that probably opened some of my failing world, and in the weeks since that funeral, interacting with my parents and their alcoholism, you know, and what that does to me, you know, when I interface with them, I understand intellectually, you know, their history of trauma, some of it, you know, their lack of healthy attachment with their parental role models, and the history of alcoholism in our ancestry as a coping mechanism, you know. And I also understand the you know, that term codependent that gets thrown around a lot in terms of relational dynamics. It has its roots in Alcoholics Anonymous. That's where that term came from, was the dependents were the people that had the substance dependencies, you know, and that the codependents were the partners and family members of those with the dependency issue, and they display a range of behaviours that's unique to a codependent, and that will be the constantly trying to take care of others' needs, people pleasing, lack of boundaries, you know, overcompensating. So, you know, it's one thing to intellectually understand all of that and to be able to psychoanalyze things and have that knowledge, but then there's the experiential realm as well, you know, that is when I'm around that alcoholism, you know, in that family system, it just completely deregulates me, you know, completely emotionally deregulates me, and I will experience confusion, emotional flashbacks, shame spirals, lack of self-worth, all that fun stuff. So, and also what I'm mindful of that it does is also, because there's that level of emotional turmoil going on, will also make me go into fantasy about relationships, will make me idealize and pedestalize, particularly, you know, a woman, whoever that woman is that is the projected love object at that time. You know, I will want to fantasize that they are this ideal relationship, where the reality of it is that relating is quite challenging for me, you know, and quite painful, and having a very anxious attachment model, you know, looking for that security in connection with somebody, you know, it can come from a very place of desperation, you know, where that sort of wounded inner child that's desperately seeking connection, desperately seeking the soothing and co-regulation of a parental figure, that will be projected onto the love object, and then there's the potential for me to seek that out in somebody, which has its own problems.
It is interesting, just that fantasy, and even at men our age, still fantasizing about the parent model, and how you would like that parent model to be, and how you wish it would be, and then there's the reality state of that. What I'm quite interested in is you were talking about cutting off. Someone like me who's a bit of a white knight, a bit of a I have a lot of empathy for people, so I'm constantly getting myself into a space where I can see someone's wound and want to help them. How do you find the place before the cutoff? How do you frame? How do you? I suppose what I'm trying to get to is how do you understand where your boundaries are and what your frame, your frame is? What sort of techniques can you sort of start with there?
Well, I guess self-reflection through critical self-reflection practices, and some of those are learned through therapy. Noticing what your triggers are, and when you're triggered, that emotion is the energy that is the impulse towards behavior. So sometimes people don't have very good impulse control, and so it's very hard for them to stop behaving in a way to pull themselves up, because that impulse, in this case for me, the impulse towards connection is so strong and so great, and I think it's a core, that particular one, is a core need for most people, is a sense of connection, a sense of belonging and tribe. And I was talking with some friends last night about this, about the importance of touch in that connection, because we connect in various ways, and obviously therapeutically, in say counselling, talk therapy, it may be very cognitive, but initially you're working from the top down, the cognitive level, the emotional level, the physical, and so you might start with the cognitive level, and you're trying to guide somebody into their emotional content, and then to have the somatic experience of what those feelings and things are like. And then there's the other way, which is just to work from the bottom up, to work with the somatic experience and with the touch first, and how soothing that can be, and that can also help release emotional imprinting, and then to change the rewiring of the cognitive. So there's no right or wrong, there's preferences with that, but the importance of physical touch in that, I think, is can't be underestimated, and that as a child does, oftentimes they'll come to you for that physical reassurance, because it calms their nervous system. It co-regulates them. In the work that I do with young people in residential care, youth work, we're taught to help to co-regulate, and there's various means and techniques that we have with that, and it's the same with counselling, how to help somebody else co-regulate. And it makes me wonder too whether it's actually possible to self-soothe or to self-regulate, or if that's only possible in the presence of somebody else. In lots of the literature and study on trauma, it talks about the importance of the tribe, and that in say mammals, that when they're distressed, they call out, and it's that protection that they get from the larger group, that helps them to feel safe, you know, and in lack of that, then they go into the extreme fight or flight response. So, what was the question again?
Well, it was in regard to that standpoint of
the boundaries
of the boundaries. Yeah.
So, it's perhaps sad to say, but when, in my experience, my experience and my understanding, you know, when you've got somebody who is extremely narcissistic, that they have created such a false persona, a mask, a shell, you know, ultimately it's probably to protect that traumatized, vulnerable inner child of theirs. But statistically, with, say, narcissistic personality disorder, those people don't show up to therapy, and they don't heal from those traumatic wounds, because they've created such a false reality, and that they've got a vested interest in keeping other people convinced of that persona and the narratives that they spin. They oscillate between a victim and perpetrator, or victim tyrant dynamic. So oftentimes they're very charismatic, and that the allure of that personality, whether it's because of the charisma or whether it's because of the victimhood, like what you mentioned before about, you know, white knighting and rescuing. Obviously, empathy and care and compassion are qualities that we might value, you know. And I think that there are particularly, that there's in men, you know, that there are hardwired into us mental schema, particularly for protecting women, protecting those that are more vulnerable than us. And that those schemas can be activated in us when somebody is, I'll say, playing the victim, you know, because I think that culture has indoctrinated, particularly with feminism, has indoctrinated women into this idea that they are victims, and that there's secondary payoffs and gains for behaving in that way. That's not to say everybody's playing the victim all the time. Of course, we're dynamic beings, and there are traumatic events that we experience in our life, and times when we need care and where we have literally been victims. But differentiating when it's somebody with narcissistic or sociopathic tendencies that don't have an interest in actually healing. They have more of a vested interest in attention, and it doesn't matter whether that attention is because of positive or negative behavior. They're just invested in getting that attention, because that's, you know, in a way that co-regulates them, you know, in a way. But in my experience, again, when recognizing the tendency, you know, to have these unhealthy codependent tendencies, and oftentimes people, they might call themselves empathic or sensitives. Oftentimes it's a hypersensitivity to growing up in a family system or an environment that was quite dangerous, you know, maybe physically, maybe emotionally, and that you had to be hypervigilant to adapt and survive within that environment. And so you still have that hypervigilance. It's still your nervous system being tweaked out and, you know, being in a fight or flight response.
100%.
Yeah. And so developing a healthier sense of self is what helps us to develop healthy boundaries, so that we can put a boundary in place and not be victimized by somebody else's tyrannical behavior. I was sharing a story with you earlier about a friend last weekend that was, explaining his experience of being assaulted by a woman who he was in deep partnership for some period of time, and her being physically abusive to him and beating him to the point that he was on the ground and being kicked in the balls, and him not being able to put up that healthy boundary, and put a stop to that. And when you're in a deep shame spiral, it's very hard to differentiate yourself and the other. You will internalize, and because of that lack of self-worth, you will internalize, there must be something wrong with me.
Yeah.
I must have attracted this to myself. I must deserve this.
Well, systemically also we're being, it's being shoved down our throats, and if you're a weak male, then you're not, in that level of sort of pecking order for just the way that you're able to function in the world. And so it's judged. It's judged for being, a man's is meant to have these boundaries or be acting a certain way, and that would never happen to you, that kind of thing. But all this stuff's behind closed doors, and like you said, the shame spiral's there, so you're not really sharing it.
That's right.
With many people.
Yeah, and like, as I'm sure you have, being in your mid-40s, like, seen people literally that have killed themselves because of those deeply held secrets that, shame can have people hang on to, because it's, you may feel that, that nobody understands, and that these parts of you are too disgusting or worthless or whatnot, to be able to be shared with people. And that's the challenge of therapy, or the challenge of like having a healthy group of friends, that you can share these deep parts of yourself with, and unpack and unravel, the shame that sort of twists and distorts our sense of self.
And that shame unhinges you as well in the fact of making the right decisions and setting those boundaries. You'll tend to just sort of keep going in that sort of way. It's because of me that they're sort of saying these things, or that's okay, they can be that way, I'm not judgmental on them. But really, you're just sort of perpetuating the problem.
Yeah, your own trauma is reactivated.
Yeah.
I was thinking about it, just before I came over here this morning, the way that, when we're really little, when we're babies, we've literally come out of the environment of the womb where, we're in this watery environment. There is no separation between us and our mother's body, and when we're born, we're still, not everybody, of course, but a lot of the time, we're still connected to the mother's body so much, we're suckling, breastfeeding, and there is still not a sense of you and other, that ego sense of self, a healthy sense of self that develops through role modeling, through witnessing how mother and father interact with each other and you, that the boundaries are not there. And so when you experience a deep regression, it can take you back into those places where you don't have a sense of yourself. You're in such a deep shame spiral because of the imprinting that happened so early that you've taken on this perception and belief that, there must be something wrong with me if I'm experiencing this behavior outside of myself with my parents or primary caregivers, that must be a direct reflection of me, you know, and the mirror neurons and imprinting that are happening as you're witnessing that, you know. So, that's really deeply wired within us, and that, you know, I'm really big on the attachment models, you know, that they're really the crux of, you know, whether we're able to develop a secure, healthy sense of ourselves, and that lots of therapy, you know, in adult life is really a form of reparenting, where the therapist may be actually the first secure attachment model that a person has had, where they can actually have enough trust in that relationship that they can explore some of these really challenging feelings that are wrapped up and buried within this, you know, shame pit.
Trust. Having the trust. I was very fortunate to be able to spend some time with a Gestalt therapist, and in a lot of that there was little bits of like role playing, and also sort of nature study. I call it nature study, where you go into nature and you would connect with something that you pick up off the ground, and what's the first thing that would come into your mind. You would write a little story about that, and then how that would then correlate into those little parts of yourself that you weren't even conscious of, you know. And then that little story that you're talking about might then start to come in as a pain somewhere in the body, and then that therapist is there to just keep guiding you sort of along that way. And this is talk therapy that I'm talking about. There's also bioenergetic release therapy. I did a podcast with Trevor Wills. Exactly what he taught. He's talking a very similar thing that you're talking about, but he starts in with pressure points and that touch aspect. But he doesn't let you go. You're not just sort of laying there going, oh, I'm just blissing out here in sort of floating Buddha land. He's talking to you, he's engaging with you, he's following these pathways, he's kind of like finding where you're maybe a bit stuck and challenging you on that. And that's part of the therapist as well, isn't it? To sort of just to challenge you where you're at. You know, but you might not want to go there that particular day, and that's fine. But you might think back later and kind of go, that was a really good opportunity. I kind of missed there. I feel like I missed that. I want to go and sort of explore that a bit more. And
well, I guess, you know, people would call that, you know, pushing your edges a bit, hey? You know, like that it can be edgy for people when you've got the trust is the key word that you just mentioned then, is that, if you're going to have somebody help to guide you into these places that are very challenging to experience, there has to be enough trust there, that, you know, when you open a very vulnerable part of yourself, you know, that there's a container that you'll be held safely in, you know, that probably wasn't there in the formative years, that needs to be there to have those parts of ourselves that are undeveloped to grow.
And when you're mentioning that container there, I'm working with a group of men at the moment who are focusing on creating this container, which is basically forming a culture. This is a bunch of men that have said, like, wow, we feel connected to place, we feel connected to country here. This area supports us, it nurtures us. It's why we've all moved here and we all live here. And then we have these young boys coming through. Some are boys of the men, some are mentors of boys and have the father figure there. And for the last 8 months, talking about how we form a culture, a new culture, without, you know, these kind of labels like rites of passage and initiations and things like that. I mean, I think they come hand in hand with the culture. And so, you know, once this is established, and like I'm saying, like, this is 8 months of sitting around a fire, just yarning and talking and coming up with concepts and ideas because it's new. I think we would have thought there would have been more boys and the call out would have been sort of reached. But I'm also understanding that as this simmers and this boils, there is such an importance with even just the men getting together and having this time to really nut it out. So when the boys are introduced into this work, the men are sitting there in a nice, comfortable and confident space because, again, us men are also those little boys. You know, we've seen the lack of from our own experiences and lack of. And so how can we impart, you know, a new concept? You know, it's not from reading books, although there's some amazing literature there that is sort of helping and supporting. There's also cultures outside, you know, experiences that we've had with either Indigenous cultures, Native American culture, whatever your cultural experiences are, how you bring that in without appropriating, per se, that culture or watering down something. I don't think there's a need to water down anything. I think we've got enough in us and from our inherent cultures, even though they were, taken away from us a lot longer than our local Indigenous cultures. We all have that inner culture, but how we find that within ourselves and sort of start reciting it. Yeah. And it's been an awesome experience and a deep healing and a deep connection. You know, I've got this band of brothers that I could share anything with. And there's heaps of banter and laughter and all of this, but it's in a good, clean space.
You know, as you're talking about that, it's making me reflect on, you know, the importance of men's work for in my experience, and how, you know, I've found deep care and connection from men, you know, and I think that there's a time and a place where only healing for men can happen with men, and likewise that there's time and place where it's women's business. You know, of course there's a time and place for those to come together, but it's important to do that men's work and have positive masculine role models, and just be around testosterone and as you said, you know, like be able to share the depths of your pain, but also it's some deep laughter and joy and challenges and experiences. And as I'm reflecting on that, something I've been considering, you know, the last few weeks as well, is the way that when we don't have that positive masculine role modeling in our life for whatever reason, because of an absent father, because of a father with substance abuse problems, they're just not present. They've got their own trauma, and that comes out in various ways. That masculine energy can be frightening, you know, and I think that for many young men that have been very feminized, that coming into a masculine space can be very intimidating and frightening, you know, because they haven't experienced the masculine as being safe and as being a container that they can be held in and heal. I even reflect back on my earlier days where that was the case for me. You know, it felt safer to be around women, and yeah, it could be potentially frightening to be around men, and you know, you have to move through that. Yeah, have to move through that experience, and again find the nurturing and healthy challenge with men as well, you know. But that's been part of my journey in that. I'm sure you can perhaps relate to that as well.
Yeah, definitely. I had a dominating father, so and my mother left when I was quite young, so I was then basically put into a kind of like I really took over my mother's role. You know, father extremely sort of anxious around money and totally driven by, you know, work and what was happening, that it put me into this sort of new place where I'm having to kind of like care for him, and that's, you're just too young. And that's why that brings in so much of that compassion, because I'm, you know, constantly thinking, okay, how am I going to make things good? I was the oldest son as well, so I was always kind of like, you know, patching up all the things my little brother was doing, or you're just like this kind of like mediator, kind of role. But all I want to do was grow my hair long and surf and hang out with my mates. Yeah. But it wasn't an option. So yeah, but I definitely you know, can say that doing certain work, you know, in regards to the psychology side of things, finding that at an earlier age, I was lucky. I mean, I was also in the military as well. So I was thrown right in the deep end of masculine abuse. I was kind of interesting though, because I'd had it from such a young age. My father was also ex-military, that I thought it was normal.
Yeah. That's your cult?
Yeah, that was my cult. And I thought that was normal. I thought the abuse that I experienced and all these things were normal. And so, you know, it's not until coming out and then your friends reflecting to you certain, you know, attributes. Maybe they were doing that thing. Maybe they were cutting me off, you know, or they were calling me out, or whatever it was, to give me that self-reflection. And so I suppose that comes back to what I was talking about before, when you're saying, you know, cutting out. Basically, there's got to be, I suppose it's nice to have the tools to be able to create boundaries before coming to that point where you have to cut someone off. Because I can understand what you're saying. There's a point where they're not picking up on the cues, on the boundary cues, and they're in that narcissistic sort of loop that just keeps feeding itself into to the point where I'm not here for this anymore. This way that, you know, we're relating. So you know, there is a cut-off point. And then maybe from that, you're giving them the gift for that self-reflection to come around. But yeah, I really feel that men's groups and working with a psychologist, because there's so much stigma around working with a psych as well.
Yeah.
And that would have all come through Hollywood, calling them a shrink and all this kind of thing. But it's not. It's just actually someone that you can have a talk to in confidence.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I feel it's immensely important, that relationship. The insights that you get from it, you know. And again, it's that person can have a wealth of knowledge and experience, and I think it comes down to, at the end of the day, the trust that you have with that person. You know, that's what I, you know, in all of my counseling, therapeutic study and whatnot, like, I've just learned to trust that is the most important element of it. You know, it's not having all the solutions and knowing what to say or how to advise somebody or whatnot. Like, sometimes going on that inner journey with another person is like, you get to points where you're like, I don't know where to go here, and that's okay, you know, like, and often just by naming that, you know, being aware of, like, that's my experience in relation to another, and being congruent with that, all of a sudden it's like the pathway opens up, and then you're navigating into new territory and finding the solutions that were within that person the whole time, you know. So I've learned just to trust that connection that you build, the relationship that you build with others. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Mm.
Because when you try to befuddle them with some words or some lingo, or try and get back in your brain something you've learned to impart to this person who's going through their moment, they see that.
Yeah, like one of the things that I found really valuable, in counselling training and also in, having therapy myself is like learning to become comfortable with the uncomfortability. That when you feel stuck or when you feel discomfort around something, like that you don't have to run in to fix it, that you just need to be with that. And that can be challenging, because like when we've got a lot of energy around something and it feels uncomfortable, like often the impulse is to seek out safety or something different to that, but it passes. The uncomfortability passes, and being able to name it and stay in an uncomfortable space with somebody, it's a skill.
Yeah, like when you see somebody cry, I love it. When I see someone crying, I'm like, oh yeah, that's, I'm here. I'm not going to come in with any touch. I don't need, depending on the person, but it's, I'm here. I'm going to witness you crying. I'm going to allow you to cry. I'm not going to feel uncomfortable about you crying because I can differentiate my emotions for these emotions right now, but this is important and this is a release. And that, that's also a really important thing to be able to do, not rush in there and try and band-aid that or, give that awkward sort of hug and pat and, you're sort of diminishing the emotion and the energy, because you can just hold space by just sitting there and going, I'm here. I'm comfortable.
Yep. Yeah, and just to play devil's advocate with that, sometimes there's the it's totally appropriate just to give that person a hug or put your hand on their back or whatnot, I guess being directed by your intuition or energy of that at the time, it makes me think of, the those parenting practices that I don't particularly agree with, of like letting young people self-soothe, without giving them any response to their calls or their behaviour for help or reassurance. Like I've seen people that have had that form of parenting that have got deep abandonment wounds because of that. I feel like when we're children that we don't have the cognitive ability or the speech to be able to express clearly what our emotions are or what the underlying needs to those are, and so that we need, ideally somebody who their limbic system is energetically attuned to yours enough to be able to respond to your cries or your body language, your protest behavior or whatever it is that's trying to direct that person to have an understanding of what you're needing at the time. And in those early formative years, those needs may be, pretty basic for food, safety, touch, connection. As you'd be aware, that Gabor Mate's work around addiction, that so much of that stems from, a lack of connection, and that when people experience that connection, that the addictive tendencies, tend to naturally drop off as a result of failing healthy connection. And I guess, coming back to, my own process that I was elaborating on before, the things that I find that I'm mindful of doing for myself, to emotionally regulate will be to develop that connection rather than desperately seek it out in the love object, and which is ultimately, generally pushes that person away because they have, too much sense of your neediness, and they can't hold all of that for you. It's unrealistic to think that another person can hold all of that, but we can do things to develop that connection with these parts of ourselves. And a lot of that for me is the somatic experience of having magnesium baths, getting a sense of my body, or mindfulness practices, meditations that help me to become aware of my body, any tension that I am holding in it that I might need to release, and how my breath is, changing the rhythm of my breath. All of the sensory experiences of touch and sight, taste, smell, just becoming aware of all those. Got a phone call coming in?
Fuck up.
Yeah, all
Sorry
good.
about that.
And then having healthy touch with people. I was fortunate the other night to go to a dance party, cacao ceremony, puja thing that I'd seen advertised up the Gold Coast, and I just intuitively was like, I need to go there. I need to move my body. Movement being another one. Dance, tai chi, qigong, yoga, all those things that bring awareness to the physical body and can help reconnect you. Being in nature, seeing all the fractal patterns that are in nature, at this dance party, it was beautiful. They started with, I think it's called a puja, where you are doing a bunch of eye gazing techniques and consensual touch, massaging somebody's shoulders or their hands or whatnot, giving consent for that, and then moving on to the next person in the group, and not having any attachment. It's like saying goodbye to that, thanking that person, being grateful for that experience that you've just had, and not having the attachment of like, I need to go back to that person to get my physical touch to help regulate my immune system, or my nervous system rather. So that, those types of practices, attending workshops and things can be quite healing. And then there's also the element of like, sometimes you need to push through your comfort zones, because when you've got a lot of anxiety going on, that can manifest as social anxiety, and you may feel that you want to self-isolate, and as important as time with yourself can be as well, the social anxiety that I've experienced a lot of that in my life, being in groups, and I guess being stuck in my head, and the inner critic and the judgment, and not being connected to my somatic experience. I was telling a client about that experience the other night of going to this dance, and you'll be familiar with this, I'm sure most people can relate to it, is like, you go to that, and being in my critic, I'll be like, oh fuck, here we go, like another bunch of fucking hippies and cacao ceremonies and fucking eye gazing and this bullshit again, and it's just, I'm stuck in the inner critic, stuck in the judgment of it all. But then it's like, okay, let's continue with this experience. And then it's like, okay, then you start eye gazing with somebody, and it's like, oh, that feels better, Oh, I'm giving somebody a hug, like, oh, I'm actually feeling my body some more now, And then going into dance, it's like, my mind initially is like, oh, I'm so tired, like I wish that I had heaps of energy and I was just pumping on the dance floor, and then it's like, well, where am I really at? I'm really tired at the moment, and I just need to yawn. And the first half an hour, here I am just like yawning and just slowly moving my body, and that was the perfect, appropriate movement for me. And as that energy starts to release and I start to get more connected with my body, sure enough, within an hour or so, I'm pumping on the dance floor, and no judgment or concern about, the projection of what others may be thinking of you. That self-concern, that being stuck in the head and not connected to the body can be, that experience. So, sometimes we need to move through that. That's been my experience anyway.
Yeah, so what I'm getting from this is that challenging yourself is therapy. Honoring yourself is therapy, and just realizing in yourself that it's okay to have these feelings or these doubts or all these kind of things, and that there is ways that you can help yourself through, and you can work through lots of different techniques. It's just a matter of finding the right support.
Yeah, definitely. All of those things that we've been discussing. Yeah. Support, movement. Yeah. I guess where I was going with that is that it's all about returning to the body. In a conversation that I was having with somebody last night, I was mentioning how much religions and things have those programs of guilt and shame that we have, particularly with the religions around sexuality and whatnot, have dissociated us from our body and caused this delusional split between the ideas of spirit and matter, and that really there's no disconnection between spirit and matter, that the material realm is the spiritual realm, in the same way as we have recognition of that mind-body connection, that what you might experience as your cognitive mind is affected by your nervous system. And so if you chill the body out through breathing and meditation or whatnot, then the mind will become calm as well. With the spirit and matter dichotomy, the only place that you're really going to experience deep connection is in your body. And as I said before, like with the sacred geometry, the spiral is found everywhere within nature. The golden mean spiral, the Fibonacci ratio. For me, the term spiral and spirit are synonymous. The spiral connects all dimensions, all timelines, and that my experience of, say, movement on the dance floor is one of spiraling, and feeling my body connected to this multi-dimensional experience when I'm fully in it and embodied in it. Yeah.
Well, this has been a great conversation, and a great reminder for me for a bunch of things that, because I think even with the amount of work that we do, we still need those reminders and ability to know that there's techniques in it for all of us. And one thing is good for someone, maybe not what someone else needs, of course. But is there anything else that you want to share before we sign off?
I'm grinning because of that, thing with the reminder, how much, we can have these revelations and insights, and that we need to keep remembering them, keep reminding ourselves. I was working with a client yesterday, and he was suggesting tattooing on his wrist the word choice, because that was a profound remembrance, realization for him that he always has choice and options, and takes him into an expanded state. And I'm like, yeah, that's great. I've had those types of ideas about permanently tattooing something in an obvious place, myself. And rest assured, you could have that right there, and you'd probably not notice it 99% of the time, and then finally have the remembrance that you put it there for that reason. And he was saying, he does that with post-it notes. He's got those little yellow notes that he's got posted all around his room to remind him of things, and they never do. And so I'd suggested getting a post-it note tattoo with choices tattooed on his wrist.
Choice, bro.
Yeah. Thanks for this, bro.
Yeah. It's therapy in itself, isn't it?
Therapy, and just our friendship and sharing is conducive to this. So thanks for holding the space and for opening this up, and hopefully when we share it to social media that it will have those positive rippling effects out there in the cosmos.
No worries.